If you're posting on social media today, which we hope you will, we would ask you to use the hashtag Integration Symposium 23 if you're into that kind of thing, as you share your experience and what's happening here at Fuller. For those of you who are joining us online and are looking for the translated version of this program, please watch this short video on how to select that function in Zoom.
Si desea escuchar la traducción del audio al español, haga clic en Interpretación en la parte inferior de la ventana de Zoom y seleccione Español.
오디오로 한국어 통역을 원하시면 여러분의 줌 화면에서 통역 버튼을 누르시고 한국어를 선택해 주십시오.
If you're joining us here for the first time, two important things are there is coffee and bagels out there in the breezeway, but also the restroom is right across the breezeway, and there is a code that is on the inside of the door here in the lobby. Please make sure you see that before you head to the restroom. If you're receiving CE units and you're joining us in person, remember to stamp out at the beginning and the end of each day and turn your evaluations in the lobby. For those online, your Zoom attendance is being recorded, and a CE evaluation form for each day will be emailed out on Friday afternoon. I also wanted to take just a moment to invite everyone here to participate in a newly launched research project in partnership with the School of Psychology and Marriage and Family and the School of Mission and Theology and the Brehm Center focused on spirituality of art. If you're interested today and Friday, stop by anytime between 12 and 3 right across the street here, catty corner to us at 509 East Walnut. You would be invited to be a participant in this study. It takes about 45 to 60 minutes, and you receive a $20 Amazon gift card for your participation. We will have a Q&A time at the end of today's program with all of our presenters. For those both online and in person, you can text your questions during any portion of the program, and the number to text is on the screen in front of you, 818-864-2141. We will try to get to as many questions as we can. There's usually more questions than we can get to, but I will give you a little tip. If you want to make sure your question gets to the top of the queue, just write one question. If you write 3 or 4, it keeps bumping you to the bottom, and I don't see you, okay? So that's a little tip, insider tip. I want to encourage all of you that are watching online to also please text your questions because we will be responding to those as well. It's now my pleasure to introduce our Fuller's Chief Operating Officer and Dean of the School of Psychology and Marriage and Family Therapy, Dr. Ted Cozy, to pray for us this morning.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. So happy to see all of you here. I know we have students here, we have alums, we have folks online, we have faculty. But first I want to know which of you are students, if you wouldn't mind just raising your hands. Welcome, students. So we have a number of students to my left from Fresno Pacific who come here annually when we've been in person. And they have an assignment when they come down here to write about the integration lectures. So special welcome to our students from Fresno Pacific. So this is this integration series is a continuation of a long series of lectures that Fuller has sponsored. The very first integration lecture was in 1961, believe it or not. A professor named Dr. Finch from Tacoma, Washington was invited down to Fuller to give a theology and psychology integrative lecture. It was a series of 3 lectures entitled Spirit and Psyche. And it was held over in Peyton, and it was sold out according to this book about Fuller's School of Psychology and the history of our school, written by the late Dr. Maloney. Our founder, Charles Fuller, sat in the front row for those lectures. And they were enthusiastically received back in 1961. And in fact, 3 years later, we started a clinic here on the Fuller campus. And a year after that, in 65, started our School of Psychology, the first in the country on a seminary campus. So these lectures have a very rich history. And did you enjoy yesterday's lecture? As did I. This is why I came to Fuller. To get my degree, a PsyD. precisely because of what Fuller offers through these lectures. And I remember being really excited back in 2005-06 when I interviewed here on the campus and met many people, got excited about Fuller, rushed back home, told my pastor, "I'm going to Fuller." And he said, "Bad mistake. They're heretical. They're liberal. You really don't want to go there." He actually had several of his seminary friends at different seminaries email me and warn me not to come here. And I read those thoroughly. And after I read them, I couldn't wait to come to Fuller. Everything they were telling me was, this is what I want. I want the kind of dialogue that they were warning me against. But I did do some research. They said, read this book called The Battle for the Bible, which I read. Many of you probably have read it too. And then some of them told me, read this book called Reforming Fundamentalism. So I read the books, and I still wanted to come to Fuller. And I'm so glad I'm at Fuller precisely because of the kinds of lectures that we're going to hear today. I was so moved and so excited about what we heard yesterday. Looking forward to continuing that. So now, Brett, I will pray, which is what you really asked me to do. So please bow your heads. Heavenly Father, thank you for this gathering. Thank you for bringing us all together. Thank you for your Spirit being in this room. Thank you for our lecturer, our faculty respondent, our student respondent. Give them peace and calm as they convey your word. We just pray all of this, and we just thank you for all the attendees here and online. Amen.
Thank you, Dr. Cozy. Again, my privilege to introduce to you Dr. Julie Exline, who serves as a professor of the psychology of religion and spirituality in the Department of Psychological Sciences at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. Her research centers on the interface of clinical, social, and personality psychology with a special focus on topics involving spirituality, religion, and existential concerns. She's a licensed clinical psychologist in Ohio and has been certified as a spiritual director through the Ignatian Spirituality Institute at John Carroll University. She is the author of numerous articles and is the co-author with Kenneth Pargament of Working with Spiritual Struggles in Psychotherapy, From Research to Practice, which many of us highly recommend to you. Her current research focuses on a wide array of topics around spiritual struggles and spiritual attributions, including gratitude and anger toward God, perceptions of after-death communication, beliefs about supernatural evil, and the many ways that people perceive God's voice in their lives. If you joined us yesterday, it was rich, it was provocative, it was fun, and so we're so thankful to have you again, Julie, with us today. Please come and welcome Dr. Exline.
Thanks so much, everybody. So thrilled to be back with you again, and greetings to everybody who's with us online as well. So today, this is going to be first of two talks on spiritual struggles, which is a topic that I've been interested in ever since I switched careers from computer science and went into psychology. And today I'm going to be sharing a little bit about my personal background, that how I got interested in this topic, because it is something that is very personal for me in terms of my energy of how I got into this. So I hope you'll bear with me as I take a little while to get around to talking about a little bit of the research on the topic. And like I did yesterday, I'm going to have references up on some slides, but I mostly have those in there just for people who are emailed the PowerPoint, so you'll have some references in there. I'm not going to spend time on those reference slides today, but I wanted to get the references in there for people who are interested. Also, there might be some elements of my personal story today that some of you might resonate with, things from your own past, or maybe even you might hold current beliefs that are similar to the ones that I was raised with. And I just want to be clear that I don't want to offend anybody. I'm not trying to make claims about what's true or what's not. What I'm going to be focusing on is how certain religious beliefs and experiences affected me as a child and as a person, and how they got me interested in studying spiritual struggles. So I just want to be clear about that. Apologies in advance if anything that I say makes anyone uncomfortable or offends anybody. I'm not trying to do that. So I like to think of this metaphor. You know, we talked about metaphors yesterday of the nautilus shell, weaving things together. And there's this idea too of just our life's journey and all the things all the curves that we go around and the things that we learn along the way. We can't tell what's coming next. I wanted to start with telling you a little bit about the roots of my own spiritual life and how they led to my interest in spiritual struggle. So I was born in Alpena, Michigan. So we Michigan people have to do this thing of holding up our hand. So it's up here. So it's in the northern part of the Lower Peninsula, just a small city. We had a community college and a big high school, but still pretty remote, blue-collar industrial type of town. And I was born there. This is 1967. This is me with my 2 older sisters and brother. We were in a very devout, loving family. We were very fundamentalist. My parents had come from a Lutheran background, Finnish Lutheran from northern Minnesota, and wanted more of a focus on a personal relationship with God. So ended up in a Baptist church that was quite fundamentalist, and that's where I was raised. So here we are. I'm the little one in the vest. You can see my sister giving my brother the Vulcan neck grip, Spock. That's why he looks a little surprised. And I actually came across this on my bookshelf last year when I was preparing another talk. My dad used to sit and have devotions with me every night before I went to bed, from the time I was really little until, I don't know, maybe mid-elementary school. And there were a few different books that he read from, but there was this one called the Children's Bible, and I found I still had it on my bookshelf. I probably hadn't opened it in 45 years. And it still had my little Betsy Clark bookmark inside. My books are friends that never fail me. So what I'm going to be doing is showing you some pictures that are actually straight out of this book, because I remember them from my dad reading the stories to me. So, and there were all kinds of cool things and happy things. You know, you've got Adam and Eve in the garden. And how many of you remember flannel graphs from Sunday school? So you put the piece of flannel on the board and put the different things up there to tell the story. So I go to Sunday school. We went to church a lot, you know, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and I was also in the Awana Club, some of you might be familiar with, scripture memorization, okay? So we were in church a lot. And there were these cool things like Noah's Ark. Who doesn't love the story of Noah's Ark? There's all the animals going in 2 by 2. This is wonderful. This is a picture of Jesus that we had at home. And these are out of the book, these wonderful stories of Jesus and all these different miracles. You've got people being healed, people being raised from the dead, the amazing fishing trips that always seemed to go better when Jesus was along. And we were definitely taught that Jesus loved the little children and sang songs about that. So after all of this, we would hear all these stories, and of course, what would we go and do? We would have Kool-Aid. Oh yeah. And if we were lucky, some cookies. We didn't usually get cookies that were this good. These are the best kind because you could eat them like a ring off your finger. If there's some of those in the back, I'll take those, but those are hard to find. So that was really cool. We had all this good stuff going on. But at the same time that I was learning these stories, so here's the Adam and Eve story, there was the part about the serpent and the temptation. And of course, it was Eve's fault that everything fell apart. That didn't turn out really great for women. And then, of course, they had to leave the garden. So that was just part of the story, that from a very young age, you're having to integrate all of that. And then there are other upsetting stories that I remember. I remember my dad trying to explain them to me, and it was uncomfortable sometimes. So we had Abraham being asked to sacrifice Isaac. Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed, and Lot's wife being turned into a pillar of salt because she turned around and looked back. That's scary stuff. All the plagues in Egypt, that poor little kid with all those flies and things turning to blood. It's pretty horrifying stuff. And then some of the amazing miracles, like remember yesterday talking about the direct supernatural effects, things like God parting the Red Sea, with Moses doing his part there. That's so cool. These are these amazing Bible stories, right, that everyone remembers. But I remember being really upset because then it closed up. And what about all those Egyptian soldiers? What about their families? What about all those poor horses? What did they do? So it was really, it was upsetting. How many of you remember This Was Your Life? This is a Jack Chick tract. Some of you are going to have no idea what I'm talking about. These are evangelistic tracts. That came out. A lot of these came out in the 60s and 70s. They're still around. And I found this online. I'm going to go through this really fast, and I cut out a bunch of pages. But this is one that I remember from when I was really little, called "This Was Your Life." And he was playing with the "This Is Your Life" show from the 60s. Basically, you've got this rich guy. You see his Stingray Corvette there, eating, drinking, and being merry. And of course, he's smoking, because drinking and smoking are really bad. And he's got his fancy stuff. And then the Grim Reaper comes, and God calls him, and he dies unexpectedly. And then his life is going to be reviewed. And life reviews are a part of a lot of near-death experiences, but usually what people report is something in a more loving context, where they feel like they're loved and supported by God, or maybe by other family members or angelic beings. They usually feel safe, and then they report having their life reviewed and feeling a lot of things about it, but it's not seen as a terrifying, shaming thing. But this was different. So this idea, this was your life, it's going to be reviewed. Everything that he's ever done is going to be revealed. And of course, look, he looks grumpy even as a kid, right? And of course, the sins that are focused on, this is a very purity culture, type of mentality. A lot of focus on sexual sins that are going to be exposed. And then the book of life is going to be opened, and his name does not appear. So this is just scary. Depart from me, ye cursed, into the everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. And this particular image of him being thrown into the lake of fire is one of those that's still burned into some level of my brain. It's part of my memories that probably isn't going to just go away. We also had a very big focus on the rapture in my church. So the thought was that Jesus could come back at any moment without any warning. You couldn't count on any certain type of signs because they could be read in different ways. It could happen now. So there's no time. And we sang songs, some of you might remember, "I Wish We'd All Been Ready." Anybody remember that? There's no time to change your mind. The sun has come and you've been left behind, right? And we would sing that and think about things like, my friends and I, even though we had all been saved, there's always that little anxiety, like when you would come home and there was nobody home, there'd be that little fear that maybe you'd been left behind. All right, let's have some Kool-Aid. Yeah, some cookies. Right. Okay. So we think about the benefits that religion can bring. I don't have references on these. These have been shown in many, many places. So for many people, Christianity and other faiths can bring attachment, security, meaning, and purpose, ultimate hope for the future and the afterlife, reduced fear of death, guidance around moral decisions, and social support from a community. These are all benefits of religion. So did I experience these with my religious upbringing? Did I have this sense of ultimate hope and this reduced fear of death? I would say yeah, but only if you choose the one correct and narrow path. So, again, I realize that many people in this room may hold these beliefs. Others might have been raised with them, but it was definitely the belief that hell was the default. If you didn't specifically say the sinner's prayer and receive Jesus as your Savior, you were going to hell. Maybe even if you'd never even heard about Jesus, that was just the default. So you had to find this narrow way. Here's how old I was when I learned those ideas. So I'm the third one from the left. This was my 6th birthday party with Joyce and Mary and Beth Ann and Linda and Emily. Did I have a sense of attachment, security, and comfort from my beliefs? Did I feel this sense of loving connection to God? And I would say one thing that helped me here is that my own dad was very loving and warm, so that really did help me. And my mom as well, but just thinking about the father figure here. I would say yes, but it's assuming that you get the nice side of God. So here's the classic Jesus picture you'll see on the contemporary worship things. But there's also this Jekyll and Hyde aspect that we didn't talk about, but that inside you, it was hard to not feel like it was there because that same God could do this. So when you're growing up, you're just a little kid, how are you supposed to put all that together? It's just plain scary. So how did I feel about this God? Was I part of a close-knit community with shared values? Definitely. But we also had a lot of fear and pride in this fundamentalist congregation. So with fundamentalism, there's often this sense of an embattled posture. This is the safe place, and we have to protect ourselves from outside influences. So it was very insular. We hung out with people from our church and similar churches. And we definitely had a lot of self-righteousness, too, where we would put down others who didn't follow our rules. Was there guidance about moral behavior? Oh, yes, there was lots of it, but what if you want to do something that goes against the teachings? And there were, of course, big things like divorce or abortion, no. Sex, drugs, rock and roll for us as teenagers, no. But we couldn't even dance, play cards, go to the movies. In some congregations, women can't wear pants. There's all these different rules depending on where you are. So anything where you're going outside the box might be seen as really threatening. Here's our baptism day, in case you're wondering which one is me. It's me looking like John Denver. Yeah, former boyfriend and I of a similar age. At this age, we both looked exactly like John Denver. The pictures are like indistinguishable. So I was about 10 years old here. So in this church, we had baptism by immersion. You had to be old enough to know what was going on. So we didn't do infant baptism. But before we could go and be baptized, I had to meet with the elders of the church and agree that I was going to follow all of these rules, like not going to the movies and not dancing and all of those things. Did we get moral guidance and help for self-control? Definitely. But it was often fear-based and rule-based in my particular congregation. So there's this fundamental mistrust of human nature based on the teachings about the fall and the fact that the devil could so easily pull us off the path. So we had a lot of guilt and shame about our sins. And we were definitely afraid to question the beliefs and the rules. In fact, I recently learned that a member of our congregation did dare to speak up once to the pastor about something, and the whole family was asked to leave the church. So basically got shunned for just saying, could we have some variety in the sermons and not have a salvation message every week because everybody in the church is probably saved? Like, could we talk about something else? And they got thrown out of the church. So I followed the rules. There I am with my Awana trophy. This is the Meritorious Award in about 8th grade. I'm a rule-following type of person, so I followed the rules, but I was troubled by a lot of this stuff. And then later on, I married the first guy that I ever dated. It was an abusive relationship. I was just 18. I was in college at the time. And when I was 21 and finally had some insights and got up the courage to leave, not all, but a good number of my well-meaning Christian friends and family said things like, of course, we don't want you to be abused, but God can work this out. And were basically encouraging me to stay. And that didn't go well for me with Christianity for quite some time. So I went through, in my emerging adult years, just, a lot of questioning. People are questioning anyway at that age. I've been at the University of Michigan. There was already lots of questioning. I had gotten married in the Catholic Church, so there was already a lot of different ideas and things that I was being exposed to. But I definitely had a lot of hurt and a lot of anger and pain around religion, even though I still always believed in God and would have still identified as a Christian. But I had a lot of energy around spiritual struggles, even though that term didn't exist at that time in the literature. But I had to wait a long time to actually study them. So like I said, I was in computer science. I had a different career, went back to school, wanted to study how patriarchal religions can keep women in abusive relationships. Gee, I wonder where that idea came from. Talk about me search. So I actually didn't get to study that in grad school, and went through a very nice graduate program in Stony Brook University, and towards the end of that program was able to get into starting to do some research on spiritual struggles. And started off with just my grad school buddy, Ann Yali, who was still a good friend. We just, at the time, we weren't aware of any other research on this, so we just started making some stuff up. Bill Sanderson was a clinical supervisor when I was on internship that worked with us on some of this stuff. We made this little measure called the Religious Comfort and Strain Scale, trying to get at the idea that religion could be a source of comfort or strain. And we just looked at three types of strain on this measure. And it didn't get used very much because at the same time, I didn't know it, but Ken Pargament was coming up with their religious coping work. And, Ken's amazing and was much more established and had a better measure. So of course, everybody was using his measure. So religious coping measures that Ken and his colleagues came up with, the RCOPE, which is the longer measure, it's got lots of subscales, it's very thorough, but a lot of people don't use it because it's really long. And the brief RCOPE, this is the short one that like everybody uses that gets at positive and negative religious coping. And one thing I just want to be clear about with this, and Ken would want me to be clear with this too, people are often trying to do things like, I want to correlate negative religious coping with spiritual struggle. Okay, the correlation will be like 1 because they're the same thing. They're the same, it's spiritual struggle is the term that we're using to refer to what used to be referred to as negative religious coping. So they are the same thing. But there were some problems with the negative religious coping items because the negative religious coping subscale, 5 of the items tap struggles involving God. So they're really focused on what we call the divine struggles. And then there's 1 about religious communities and 1 about the devil. So it's a nice measure, but it kind of just shows the positive and negative. It doesn't get into any of the nuances. So when Ken and we had met and we had worked together on APA handbook and some other things, decided that we wanted to start working together on these things and make a new measure. So really, really quickly, I wanted to just talk about a definition of spiritual struggles, where we're talking about experiences of tension, strain, or conflict about sacred matters. And that is obviously very, very, very broad. And these can focus on the supernatural, like God or the devil, could also focus on things like spirits. We just don't have that in the measure. There could be things that focus on yourself or on other people around religious issues. And there's 2 recent overviews in the talks I'm going to be giving, this one and the one tomorrow. A lot of the references that I'm going to be including are included either in our book, or if you don't want to pay for the book, it's kind of like a cliff notes of the book, like a really short version. We wrote a report for Templeton last year that has kind of the same structure as the book. It's much, much less detailed, but that's available for free online. If you just Google, Pargament X-line struggles Templeton, you can pull that up for free. So our measure, the Religious and Spiritual Struggle Scale, has 26 items and 6 subscales. And I just want to be clear, we know that these aren't the only spiritual struggles that exist. We had to leave so much out. We were going crazy figuring out. I had all these other things I wanted to include, these more like saintly struggles. And we thought, the measure's going to get too long. We're going to have that RCOPE problem where no one's going to use it. So we tried to find ones that we thought would be relatively common among people who weren't necessarily super religious, that could apply across a lot of people. But we know that this is just a starting point. And we had more items and boiled it down to 4 or 5 items per subscale. And a nice thing about this measure is you can focus on a specific time frame, like to what extent in the past week have you had these experiences, or in the last year, or when you were a kid, or a specific event, kind of like religious coping. So in response to the loss of your loved one, or in response to your cancer diagnosis, to what extent have you had these experiences? So you can use it either way. And we finally published our brief version, the RSS 14, which only has 2 or 3 items per subscale. We made this way back around the time we made the RSS. We had so many other projects, just couldn't get back to publishing this darn thing until like last year. So that we do have a nice short version, and it psychometrically is similar to the longer RSS. So if you need a shorter one, check it out. We also have a 6-item, just 1 item per struggle screener, and a 1-item screener that will hopefully publish relatively soon. So I'm going to quickly run through the 6 types of struggles. So divine struggles, these are negative thoughts or feelings focused on God or your beliefs about God. An important thing here is that they can be relevant for some people who don't believe in God. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. And here's a couple of sample items. Feeling angry at God, or feeling like God had abandoned me, and feeling as though God had punished me is another one. Most of the research that I've done on specific spiritual struggles has been on anger at God, and that's what I'm going to do at the end of this talk today. So we'll be there in like 10 minutes. Okay. Moral struggles. We tried to not use God or sin language in any of the other subscales. We just kept those on the divine subscale because we wanted the measure to be usable by as many people as possible. So the moral struggles focus on just kind of some kind of wrestling to try to follow your moral principles and guilt about failure. Here's a couple of sample items. Then we've got ultimate meaning struggles, where for many people, the term spirituality involves a sense of deeper meaning in life, which may or may not be supernatural or religious. And the struggle here is questioning whether this deeper meaning or purpose exists. And there's a few sample items for that. This is the one that's usually correlated the most highly with things like depression and anxiety, suicidality. And then doubt-related struggles, where people are having doubts or questions about their beliefs. And it's very important that this implies distress, because you might be thinking about something like a quest orientation toward religion, where people's beliefs are changing, or where they're maybe really embracing their doubts. That correlates positively with our doubt struggle subscale, but all of our struggle items have distress baked into them, or tension or strain. They're baked into the items. It's a struggle scale. So people who have doubts about their beliefs, but they're not bothered by it, would not score high on the doubt subscale. So it's worrying about whether the beliefs are correct, feeling confused, things like that. Interpersonal struggles around religion, where people are having conflicts with other people or religious organizations about religious issues. Here's a couple of sample items. My favorite one is feeling angry at organized religion. That one is usually endorsed the most, because that one can be endorsed by people regardless of whether they're religious, whereas some of the other ones are endorsed more by people who are in religious communities. And finally, demonic struggles. So this is the belief that the devil or evil spirits are attacking us or causing negative things in our lives. This is stuff that we're really getting into studying more now. It's still very understudied. And there are some sample items for that subscale. So moving on, I'm just going to give some really, really broad and general information about spiritual struggles in general, and then I'm going to focus more on anger at God. But these are very widespread. We had a large US sample, and we only have these results summarized in the book. We haven't been able to publish them just because of other commitments. This was a sample that was thousands of people. 70% reported spiritual struggles at some point in their lives, and about a third to a half said that they had some in the last few weeks. And this is across a variety of faiths, including people who don't believe in God and demographic groups. So, because spiritual struggles have some tension or strain baked into the items, of course they're going to correlate with other indicators of psychological distress. And this has been well documented. So many, many studies have shown if you're having more divine struggles, you're going to be more depressed, things like that. Really, the glass is overflowing with cross-sectional correlational studies showing that these struggle subscales correlate with distress. They're going to. So here are a few examples of studies. We had our RSS validation papers. Neil Krauss had a big landmark spirituality and health study where Hisham Abu Raya did a really wonderful paper from that. And there's also been some really great work done among veterans. So there's lots and lots. So I'm just giving a couple of highlights here. But with these studies, because they're cross-sectional, meaning the data are all collected at one point in time, there's often a question of what's causing what. So Ken Pargament and Jim Lomax came up with this really nice framework of what they called primary, secondary, and complex struggles. So with the primary struggles model, the idea is that spiritual struggles are leading to distress. So because you're angry at God, or after you get angry at God, you're going to be depressed later, for example. And there's good support for this. Margaret Bockrath did a meta-analysis of 32 studies showing good evidence for this. So if you think about how much work is available, the glass is pretty full. The struggles do seem to predict later distress, or increases in distress. And then there's a secondary struggles model. This is the idea that distress leads to spiritual struggles. So if you're already anxious or traumatized or depressed, you're going to have struggles after that. And there's some support for that. It just hasn't been studied as much. There's a few good studies showing this. And then the complex struggles model, which is the idea that struggles might lead to distress and vice versa. They kind of feed off each other. Irene Harris had one study. I just reviewed another study on this recently. There's going to be more in the literature soon on this, but right now there's very little. This requires multi-wave longitudinal studies, really expensive, and they're hard to do. But yeah, struggles lead to distress and vice versa. There does seem to be evidence for that. Some of the other correlates of spiritual struggles that have been documented a lot. Lots of associations with physical health. You would expect it's going along with emotional health. Things related to pain, HIV symptoms get worse, and higher mortality rates in medically ill older adults. That was in an early study that Ken and Harold Koenig and some others did. There's also issues around self-regulation. So things like disordered eating, you don't take your meds, you're using more substances, not necessarily watching more internet porn, but feeling like you're addicted to it. Right? Josh Grubbs, who was a grad student of mine, has done tons of work on this. And spiritual struggles are also associated with greater tendency to disengage from religion, and with a concept that Brenda Cole has called spiritual decline. And whereas spiritual struggles have to do with the idea of wrestling or conflict, decline implies more that there's been a loss, like a loss of faith, or there's been some kind of disengagement from it. So now I'm going to show you pages of references that I'm going to just blow by that are going to be the references that you saw on these pages. Isn't putting references into PowerPoint a pain? I hate that. It's such a pain, but they're here now. Okay. All right. I'm not going to be able to give you more than like a minute to think about this because I need to get to my anger at God stuff. But just something to be thinking about maybe as we continue to talk. Which of these struggles have you encountered yourself in your ministry or practice? And do you feel like you have a signature struggle, like one that's come up in your own life over and over again? Again, thinking about divine, demonic, doubt, interpersonal struggles around religion, moral struggles, ultimate meaning struggle. Just something to think about. Again, if we had a longer time, we had more of a workshop format, we'd have all kinds of cool conversations about this. But I got to keep this moving. I got to earn my keep here. Okay, so let's go back to anger at God. This is actually work that we got into before we developed the religious and spiritual struggle scale. This came more out of my interest in research on forgiveness, which is what I was working on earlier in my pre-tenure period. Kind of couldn't study religious stuff very much at a secular school, so I was doing things related to virtues. It was a little safer. So briefly, when do people get angry at God? Is it only in response to things like traumatic events? That's a lot of times what people think. Oh, it's got to be acts of God. And it's true that people will get angry at God when there's things that we can't easily blame on other people. So in any given study that we had of things like, tell me about a time when you felt like God might have been involved in some form of suffering, and and then we're looking at anger at God. Usually about half the cases involve death, like death of a loved one, or serious illness or injury, like somebody gets a cancer diagnosis. But there's also things like natural disasters and accidents. So these are things that people might play an indirect role, but these are more in that acts of God category where you can't necessarily blame somebody. But what I think is more interesting is that people will get angry at God even when people could be blamed. So these are things like, the ways that we humans hurt each other, all kinds of wartime atrocities, abuse, divorce, abandonment and betrayal. And here, a lot of times the logic is, why didn't God step in and prevent this from happening? Rather than actually blaming God that it happened, why didn't God stop this? And a lot of events that will cause people to get angry at God aren't really traumatic in that same way, but more just disappointing. So personal failures, people who don't get into the college they want, or they fail some big test, or it rains on their wedding day, this kind of thing. I had a study about 15 years ago where people wrote a letter to God about something involving suffering. The angriest letter I have ever seen like this, with all kinds of swearing, and just the student was in a rage, was a student who wanted to go to MIT and ended up at our university Case instead. It was like the angriest person I've ever seen with anger at God. So a lot of times it's just these disappointments. A lot of the stories focus on things like athletic injuries, where somebody was going to be like a football star and they got an injury. And also a theme that Josh Grubbs and I explored as part of his master's was this idea of, why did God make me this way? So maybe something having to do with gender identity, sexual orientation, or just a certain disposition that you have. Like, why did God make me with all of these reactive emotions? Why did God make me as somebody who easily gets addicted to substances? Why did God make me with this particular weakness? This just seems so unfair. Why did God make me with this bipolar disorder or this tendency towards psychosis? So you can see that with so many different situations that can trigger anger at God, they're quite common, because it doesn't require those natural disasters or acts of God. So across a whole bunch of different samples that we've looked at, usually somewhere around half report some negative feelings toward God. So if I had a sample of cancer patients and I was to say, to what extent in response to your cancer diagnosis have you felt these types of feelings toward God? And I had a list that included anger, frustration, mistrust, things like that. Usually about a half will endorse some. They're usually low in intensity. So it's more accurate to say that a lot of people are going around being kind of frustrated or impatient or disappointed with God, rather than like raging at God. But a really important take-home point, especially for anybody here who has ever felt angry at God and is maybe ashamed of it, just to know that it's a really, really, really common experience. That's something I'm going to keep coming back to. Another thing is that most people on these measures, people who believe in God, report way more positive than negative feelings toward God. So if it's on maybe a 0 to 10 scale, positive emotions, the average is around 8. Negative emotions, it's around like 2. But there might still be some anger or negative feelings lurking. So that 2 is important, even if somebody's still saying, oh yeah, I love God, God loves me, but yeah, there's this thing. And positive and negative feelings toward God show modest negative correlations. And in some studies, they'll even be positive. I won't get into some of the statistical stuff there, but it's just modest, like -15, -20. And the only reason I'm bringing that statistical point up is just that positive and negative emotions are often largely independent of each other. That they're not, just because you're angry at God doesn't mean you don't love God. Think about your relationships with people in your lives. The people toward whom you get the most angry are often the people that you love the most. So it's like that intensity of relationship. But people are often afraid, if I get angry or disappointed, it means I don't love God anymore. But the feelings really don't correlate that highly. Different ways that people cope with anger toward God. This is one of the newer measures that we've made that I haven't talked about that much. We have a behaviors toward God scale. And we looked at, these are in decreasing order of endorsement by people. Approaching God when you're angry, trying to draw close or trust God. Then we've got protest behaviors. This is where you're asking why, be complaining or arguing. Why, God, why? Then we've got suppression, where you're trying to push down the feelings or pretend you're not having negative feelings. Often part of being like a good religious person is we're going to not talk about those things. And then disengagement, where people are maybe overtly rebelling or rejecting God or pulling away, maybe having some doubts or questions about God's existence. There's some references. And the main point here is that the predictors of anger at God, people get angry at God for the same reasons they get angry at other people. So I'm not going to spend too much time here. It's not a magical different thing psychologically. So if harm is severe, if you're not close to God, you clearly see God as responsible for causing the thing rather than just allowing it. And if God's actions seem cruel or punishing or they're kind of capricious and you can't see any meaning in it, those are the types of things that will make people more angry at God. And in terms of individual differences, there are a lot, but 3 are the ones that have been looked at the most. And here we're talking about anybody could get angry at God, anybody who believes, but more intense or more frequent anger at God is more likely for certain people. So younger people, and most of these studies we're talking about 18 and up. So 18-year-olds more likely than an 80-year-old. And people who are prone to negative emotion, they're upset about a variety of things, are going to get angry at God because there's just more negative emotion in their lives. And there's a big one of having a greater sense of entitlement. So people who go around thinking the rules don't apply to me, I demand more, I expect more, tend to get more angry in general. And this anger at God is the same basic pattern. Of course, psychologists are always talking about people's relationships with parents, and definitely in terms of anger toward God, this is an important thing. Our early object relations and early bonds, very important. When you think about your initial authority figures, your God image or God representation is going to include echoes of those things. And people aren't always aware of these connections. So, for example, we had a study where we looked at a cruel kind of parent image predicts a cruel God image. And an important point here is that both parents are important. It's not just the mother, like you might think from an attachment perspective. Moms get overemphasized. And it's not just fathers, which if you're taking kind of a Freudian thing of, oh, this is a father projection, you might overemphasize that. They both feed in. And then you get more angry at God. That's the paper we did on that. But an important point here is that people aren't always aware of these connections. So a story that I often like to tell is of a a friend of mine who's really, really brilliant and not somebody who believes in God, had a terrible relationship with his father. Father was very abusive. And my friend, who's somebody super mild-mannered, would refer to his father as being the asshole, which is really harsh. And I remember once we were talking about religion, as I'm always prone to do, he said, if you drive, how you drive by a church and they have the sermon thing on the sign of what the sermon's going to be on Sunday. He said, if there was one that said, "Is God an asshole?" I'd go in. And I said, I've never heard you use that term in reference to anybody except your own father. And his response was just, it really seemed he'd never thought about it. So in your own case too, maybe you might be thinking about your father, but maybe your mother was a little more conditionally loving, or whichever parent was more stern or less available, more distant, smothering, controlling. The chances are, even if you intellectually try to not think that way, there still might be affecting your God image. So some controversies around this anger at God stuff. What about non-Western or non-theistic traditions? So the idea does seem Western and monotheistic, and I've definitely been talking about it that way here. We're doing this work in the US where most people who are religious are Christians. That bias is definitely in there. So it's the idea of God being personal and involved. But we did do a really fun study among Hindu undergraduates in India, and within polytheism, there can be this ability to switch allegiances from one God to another. And I often think of a lot of Christians as being what I would call functional polytheists, where God the Father seems scary, Jesus seems much nicer and more loving, and if you're just in the mood to be spiritual, you can go with the Holy Spirit. But people sometimes have picked their favorites. You would be afraid to say that, but I feel like I've seen that. And you can also get angry at impersonal forces like tornadoes. That's been documented in some really cool research by Laura Thompson. You could get angry at tornadoes and cancer cells, so you could certainly get angry at an impersonal God as well. And what about people who don't believe in God? When we first started doing studies on anger at God, we were going to leave out all the atheists and agnostics because we didn't want to disrespect them by asking irrelevant questions. But accidentally, some of them completed it. We found that a lot of them actually reported it. So then we wanted to look more closely at it. And what we found in the early studies that we did was that some, not all, atheists and agnostics, would actually endorse anger at God on measures. And we had probably the biggest news thing I've ever had on any of my psycho-religion stuff. I was so excited. We had this CNN article coming out in 2011 on our big Anger at God paper. The headline was, "Anger at God Common Even Among Atheists." And, we got a lot of pushback on this. And I'm quite sensitive. Like the comments that were written, I had somebody writing to recommend that I be fired and all kinds of nasty stuff in the comments. I've learned now I don't read the comments anymore. But I can see how we triggered people because it feels dismissive. We're kind of saying, you're just saying you don't believe in God, but really you're just angry. People don't like that. That's very offensive to them. I can see why they were angry. But why would a non-believer report anger at God or anger around the idea of God on a survey? Well, for some, the idea of God brings up bad memories of these times when they did believe in God and God let them down. So that's one thing. Another thing is that even if somebody's never believed in God themselves, they might have a negative image of God that they've learned from the culture. Or even if there's no idea about God, the word God brings up negative thoughts about religion and religious people and all the lousy stuff that they do. So that could lead to reporting anger as well. And C.S. Lewis also had another twist on this, where he abandoned his faith in adolescence after suffering some real traumas and losses, came back to it in his early 30s. But the part I wanted to mention is that he had maintained that God did not exist, but he was also very angry with God for not existing. We haven't been able to look at that one empirically, but it's fun to think about. And David Bradley and Alex Hughes Divinis, for grad students with me, did some really nice work on reasons why atheists and agnostics don't believe in a deity, and They tend to report intellectual reasons, but these emotional reasons they'll still endorse. This is part of it. We've looked at hypothetical God images. What would God be like if God existed? And how would you react if you found out that God existed? I wish I had time to go through those results right now. That's so much fun. And Aaron Sedlar did a really nice paper on spiritual struggles among atheists. So another controversy is, should anger toward God be seen as a problem? I have given this, not this same talk, but earlier versions of this talk to different audiences. And I've had people come up to me very concerned and kind of angry at me after the talk. After the same talk, I've had people come up and be like, anger toward God is really, it's a sin, and you're making it sound like it's totally okay and normal. I don't like the way you're normalizing it. And then I had other people come up and say, I think you're really pathologizing this, and this is really a normal part of human existence that should be celebrated. So all I'm trying to say is it's common, okay? And it correlates with other signs of distress. But you're going to have more distress if you have anger toward God that's intense, frequent, prolonged, or recurrent, as opposed to like just a flash of anger. And this is a big one. Is it morally okay to be mad at God? So many people see anger toward God as being wrong, especially in our Western, mostly Christian samples. More devout believers, people who are older, Christians in comparison to some other groups, although Muslims are not comfortable with it either. We haven't gotten to publish that yet. Jews tend to be more comfortable with it because of the lament tradition. And people who are African American tend to also be more nervous about anger at God. We haven't gotten to follow up on that, but that was a clear finding that we had. And then there's this question of whether spiritual struggle leads to growth or not. Are these struggles actually good for us? And there's really mixed findings about this, especially when you look at it cross-sectionally. When people are struggling, they may or may not look like they're growing or perceive that they're growing. But the bottom line here, because this is a big topic we're going to talk about tomorrow, is more how to respond to struggles and help people with them. Don't sentimentalize them. Don't just assume, what doesn't kill you is going to make you stronger. And just assume that the struggles are all going to be positive. They're going to all lead to positive outcomes. It's more like the response to struggle might lead to growth, but we don't have evidence that just struggling leads to growth. So I'd just like you to think a little bit more about your own journey now. Where are your roots? Where is your pain? And where do you have energy? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Exline. I can see a new bumper sticker, anger at God happens. Right? It happens. Now I'd like to introduce our two respondents. They will come up one after the other. Actually, one will be on video. Dr. Jacqueline Williams is assistant professor of the practice of preaching and chaplaincy. Before joining Fuller's faculty in 2022, Jacqueline Williams served as an adjunct instructor in preaching since 2014 and has also served as an adjunct instructor for the Meacham School of Gospel Hymeno. She holds an MDiv from Fuller and MFA in acting from the University of Washington's Professional Actor Training Program, a BA in theater from the University of Houston, and completed her PhD in theology and religion at the University of Birmingham, UK in fall 2022. Dr. Williams is an American Baptist ordained minister and an Alliance of Baptist endorsed chaplains. She has contributed articles to the Hymeno Journal, which is the official publication of the Society of Gospel Hymeno. An accomplished former professional actor and dancer, she uses these skills she honed as a performing artist to enhance her pedagogical practices with students. She often speaks on the connections found between the process of craft as an artist and the process of discipleship as a follower of Christ. Our student respondent today is Grace Chan. She is a second-year MFT practicum student at Fuller Psychological and Family Services. Please welcome our respondents, beginning with Dr. Williams.
Thank you to Dr. Exline for this holistically engaging introduction into demystifying spiritual struggle, while at the same time not shying away from the mystery that is a part of spiritual struggle. The work that she and others have done over the years has shown a light on the visceral reality of spiritual struggles. And it's worth noting that in American culture as a whole, this is something that we do not readily like to engage unless we've reached our own point of spiritual struggle, or we occupy vocational space as pastoral or spiritual care providers. And this is an important backdrop to this conversation, that we are not engaging in ordinary conversation, that the average person, even within church or in other community engagement, really speak about. These are scary waters to traverse for us as a community. And when I'm responding to Dr. Exline's work, I'm responding as a chaplain. And the work of chaplaincy often happens at the places and spaces where the struggle, the tension, the strain, the conflict can no longer be ignored. A crisis has occurred and a response is necessary. And in the midst of it all, our humanity is seeking some kind of meaning, or at least a way to make meaning from pieces of the spiritual, emotional, and physical wreckage. So acute pastoral and spiritual care, such as that which is done in the work of chaplaincy settings, is often on the go, with many other parameters impacting the literal and metaphorical space in which the care is being provided. So for example, in a patient's hospital room, as a nurse comes in with elements of care that may inflict more physical pain, we are trying to reach some sort of freedom from our spiritual struggle. Or at the scene of a human-made or natural disaster, when those who are called upon to render aid can barely face the holistic devastation that they are witnessing, they are trying to reach freedom from spiritual struggle. Or on the literal and metaphorical battlefield, the specter of moral injury looms right alongside the specter of physical injury. And the before and after moments of the protest march or candlelight vigil, where voices and bodies are seeking to find a home to be seen and heard, in the midst of all this, there is spiritual struggle. And all of these places and spaces where distortion and disengagement can render the self-rooting pain and energy resource diluted, if not even seemingly destroyed. Wholeness is at stake. Now, the struggles can run the gamut of definitions that Dr. Exline outlined for us, and they are experienced on multiple levels of consciousness. The breath, spiritually, emotionally, relationally, physically, has been cut off. And this is a way of living that is not sustainable. Even as we try to catch our breath, a wall is eventually hit, and that wall seems impenetrable. We can push and push and push, but the way over, under, and through seems completely out of reach. The work of chaplaincy is the work to embody the possibility, the hope of deeply breathing again and holding space for whatever that looks like in this moment. Spiritual struggle is an untethering from what connects us to ourselves, God, and others. Stabilization is needed. It's as if one has been placed somewhere within this picture that you see of myriad pathways and a multitude of lived theological manifestations, and he or she is trying to find their way back to what seems straightforward or easily accessible, breathable. In the acute nature of chaplaincy work, this stabilization is a triage effort. What needs to be sensed and sorted in this present moment to pave the way for deeper and perhaps more chronic care in the future? Chaplains are present and hold space while assessing appropriate interventions and outcomes. So chaplains assess the aspects of self-rooting, pain, and energy resource through story. Edward P. Wimberly helps us trace the roots and relevance of storytelling as a spiritual care framework due to the need to, quote, respond to the emotional, interpersonal, and spiritual needs of persons in crises, drawing on the rich, indigenous cultural legacy of storytelling. Chaplains are mining the story of the moment, the external conditions and conditioning, as well as the story of the person or persons to whom care is being provided, the internal condition and processing. Chaplains are not there to change or pull the rug out from under someone's cultural, theological, or even psychological perceptions in this moment, because the moment of acute crisis is not a moment for deconstruction of self, unless the care receiver is already walking that path. We are working in chaplaincy with the raw materials. We may do some tender reframing work if the relationship seems to be able to hold up to this intervention, and that may look something like replying, "Crying is a part of our makeup." And we can find a safe and private space for you to do that when someone shares that they don't want to cry. But overall, care provided by a chaplain may look like a combination of many interventions that encompass attuning presence to the moment and assessing for appropriate interventions. And these interventions can be categorized as, first, accompaniment, right? An ocular demonstration of you may feel like it, but you are not alone. 2, active listening. An embodiment of I see you, I hear you, your struggle matters, and you are more than your struggle. 3, hospitality. Practical needs being met. So a cup of cold water or coffee, a towel to wipe the forehead, a warm blanket, food, a place to sit down. And 4, spiritual reconnection. Knowing that spirituality includes religious practices and traditions, but is not only religious practice and tradition. So this may look like a prayer, a poem, a phone call to a loved one, deep breathing, guided meditations. The spiritual struggle manifests emotionally, spiritually, and physically, and so the care is as multi-layered as the story. And as the story unfolds, chaplains attune with and through presence. So where is the greatest area of distress or disconnect? What are the present resources that can be utilized? And what are the interventions that meet that acute need? And then chaplains assess on the go, moving with the flow of the story. What are the acute spiritual, emotional, and relational stress points and struggles? Because they move, they change, they flow. What are the resources of rooting, pain alleviation, and energy resource that are already evident within the care receiver's life? And then also, are the outcomes realistic? Are the outcomes realistic? So while engaging this back and forth, action, reflection, action, care model, the chaplains must seek to be present to their own acute and chronic spiritual struggles. See, when we listen to the stories of others, our own stories may crystallize in some way. And the space between my story and your story is sacred ground. And from this in-between space, our story emerges. And there is strength in the realization that there is an our story. So this ongoing attunement and assessment of the spiritual struggle is a distinction, but not a compartmentalization between the work of therapy and chaplaincy. Carrie Doring says, pastoral caregivers bring theological, cultural, and psychological expertise to evaluating personal and public theologies in order to account for suffering in complex, systemic, and interdisciplinary ways. Chaplains and therapists do this work. So we as pastoral caregivers share with and learn from each other's processes and practices, and hopefully we collaborate explicitly and implicitly. Although there is one clear distinction, in that the question of growth is not at the forefront in chaplaincy care, generally speaking. So movement towards the hope of connectedness for the moment, so that the next step of healing and recovering can even be entertained, is at the forefront for chaplains. In that acute moment, it is a big question mark about whether someone will grow from this experience, or should someone be growing from this experience. We are seeking to support the care receiver in realizing, even if only for this moment, I am breathing. Therefore, there is life. Thank you, and thank you again to Dr. Exline.
Hi everyone, I'm Grace. I first would like to say thank you to Dr. Julie Exline. I am so grateful for your exploration of anger. And the first thought is, if anger is an indicator of injustice done to self or someone you care about, or a group of people you care about, I wonder how we can continue to deepen the exploration of anger in clinical settings, in healing spaces, with new understandings of anger and spiritual struggles. And thank you to Dr. Jacqueline Williams on Zoom. I just admire chaplains. The work you do is incredible. And whenever I think of chaplains, I think of the image of Jesus just reaching out to grab Peter from the waters. I'm so thankful for how you model your embodied presence. Yeah. So the way I would like to structure my student response is to provide my personal lens, my current context, and some questions I have. So let's start with my personal context. I'm from Malaysia, but I lived in Beijing from 2008 to 2013, New York from 2013 to 2018, and then Hong Kong from 2018 to 2021, and finally I am here. Right? So growing up for the first 13 years of my life in Malaysia, spirituality isn't a singular topic that we incorporate. It's normal, regardless of religiosity. There simply is this environmental sense that there is a reality beyond what we can see. And to deny that is to be naive. I grew up with haunted toilet stories in my elementary school. Frequent stories of unexplainable healings through spiritual means like exorcism, or this thing called bomos, which is a Muslim shaman, or just rituals in general. And my American boyfriend pointed out when he visited Malaysia this past winter, you would never see a mosque, a Hindu temple, a Christian church, a Buddhist temple, a Catholic church all on one street in America. But you would see that in Malaysia, everywhere. So even if you don't believe in God or a higher power per se, you would still visit the gravesites of your ancestors. You would burn incense daily for the prosperity of your business. So for the majority in Malaysia, there is a tether to another world beyond this reality. So for my church in Malaysia, that was technically Methodist, but very charismatic in practice, spiritual warfare classes were the norm. And tongues were like our fourth or fifth languages because we are multilingual. And I remember vividly at the age of 12, I and the rest of us in the youth program, we went through a session of learning how to speak in tongues. And by the end of the hour, somehow we were all able to speak in tongues. I grew up seeing people who were once possessed become free, insane become sane, ostracized become integrated. I grew up witnessing deliverance. And these deliverers were people whose characters matched their faith. So these kind of miracles paired with adult figures who were congruent in faith and virtue are the foundations of my faith throughout my childhood. But I do want to spend some just a moment to point out that not this sentiment of spiritual warfare is triggering to some, especially those who were victims of abusers, who use spiritual warfare as a tool of manipulation. It is important to acknowledge that not all who use spirituality are good or have good intentions. So then after that, I moved to Beijing in 2008 at the age of 13. On top of puberty and overall life adjustments, one of the struggles I encountered was the church we attended in Beijing. As internationals, we could attend the international church by showing our foreign documents at the door. But because at that time there is only one international church to cater to all the internationals in Beijing, the church was effectively non-denominational and as palatable as possible, using their words. I found it weird as a 13-year-old that tongues were not allowed, and that in general, there's just no demon possessions in China, right? The China I had was one of Orientalist tropes from TV shows that were rooted in Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and these were mostly created by Chinese immigrants who left before or around 1949. But the China I entered in 2008 was one that was marred by the Cultural Revolution that eradicated traditions and religions, leading to a spiritual desert that science, politics, and secularization sought to fill. So you would think that the same sensations I felt in China, the same ones I'm thinking about my time in America, basically. And I find it funny that the same feelings I feel in China are the same ones I feel here. And you would think, this is a Christian nation. And I acknowledge that I lived in New York and now I'm in Pasadena. These are two very secular places. And maybe the Midwest or the Bible Belt might feel really different. But I want to provide the contrast of Malaysia and Beijing, two places I lived in before the age of 18, to show where my spiritual intuition is when I am where I currently am. And to take a moment to think about my own biases towards secularized places, I'm reminded of a moment I shared with a friend of mine who is second-generation Colombian, born and raised in America. One day, out of the blue, he just asked me if I believed in demons and them having influence over humans. And I was like, definitely in Asia, but not in America. And my rationale for that answer was I just know how spiritually unalive I feel in America, but also the Screw Tape Letters by C.S. Lewis. Knowing how Wormwood sometimes just didn't need to do much because his human was already so caught up in work and technology and human relationships. Wormwood was like, I don't need to do anything. Let the world do its thing, But then my friend responds, as a kid in America, he was visited by demons in his dreams. He vividly describes the images. He then says he stopped experiencing them ever since he grew out of childhood. Then he said his mother had also experienced it, and also his family members in Colombia. So I'm not just wrestling with this desert feeling that I have of being in America in a context that does not speak of the spiritual as normal. And I'm not even talking about spirit like crystals, Ouija boards, or like sound baths. I'm talking about positioning of self in relation to the world. And I also am holding and wondering how much of our spirituality is generational, beyond environments, and perhaps embedded into our DNA, our blood, because of curses that span generations. So now my current context. I'm training to be a marriage and family therapist. My current practicum site is right up the stairs, Fuller Psychological and Family Services, great therapists. I love it there. And one of the reasons I came to Fuller is if I wanted to help people heal as a therapist, I wanted to come to a place that would actively integrate my spiritual ideas of healing. And I knew that in pursuing this career path, my faith could not be an add-on. It needed to be fully integrated and reckoned with. And so I'm so grateful to have my first experiences at FPFS as a therapist in training where the majority of my clients are spiritual/religious. It's so fascinating to see how their relationship with God, Jesus, the Holy Spirit, and the church affects and reflects their current dysfunction or journey towards healing. And even for those that aren't explicitly religious, There is something otherworldly about experiencing safety and healing in a vulnerable, intimate relationship. And so, whether or not a client experiences spiritual struggles, the Christian in me cannot help but spiritualize the struggle. And obviously, not in a way that imposes theology or is coercive to go where the client doesn't want to go. What I mean is that if I neglect God's purposes and the Holy Spirit in the clinical space, I'm effectively ignoring not only a large part of who I am and what makes me unique as a clinician, but also possibly missing parts of my clients that need to be seen in a sterilized, secularized healing space. When I'm sitting in a room with a client who is struggling to win against suicide, there is something else working against me and my client other than a DSM-5 depression diagnosis. When I'm walking with a client through the patterns they see in themselves from their family of origin, I cannot help but think about how my role and the client's experience mirrors the first words from God about himself in Exodus 34, verses 6 to 7. The Lord passed in front of Moses, calling out, Yahweh, the Lord, the God of compassion and mercy. I am slow to anger and filled with unfailing love and faithfulness. I lavish unfailing love to 1,000 generations. I forgive iniquity, rebellion, and sin, but I do not excuse the guilty. I lay the sins of the parents upon their children and grandchildren. The entire family is affected, even children in the third and fourth generations. It is so humbling to know that I get to be a small reflection of God's compassion, forgiveness, and love as a therapist. But it's so sobering to be reminded that the consequences of sin are intergenerational trauma, deep sickness, relational brokenness. So my framework in entering the symposium was to continue putting pressure on the tension between the spiritual and the clinical. I am still reconstructing my theological grounding as a Christian and building up my conceptual home base as a clinician, but I'm a huge fan of the new wave of activism that advocates for reconnection with nature, with self, with traditions, liturgies, hymns, with the old that wasn't actually bad because it's not new, And just because the spiritual is not necessarily scientific or rational or new, allowing the ambiguity and flexibility of spirituality can still be valid and true in supporting the healing process. And spirituality can manifest in so many ways if we allow ourselves to see it, through a client's growing ability to be comfortable with the unknown, and increase awareness of spiritual attributions that leads to a more positive mindset like karma or blessings, a shifting posture towards forgiveness of self and others that heals generations of unspoken pains and hurts. I believe the Spirit is always moving, and it is my hope that our sails stay open, wide open to his winds, even when the clinical space has been canonically been sanitized and secularized. So this leads to my questions. The first one is, what should be the relationship between clinical intuition and the whispers of the Holy Spirit? My current approach in therapy is very much the here and now, the relationship between me and the client, what I feel informs the work. And I'm always interested in honing my clinical instinct. And that approach does parallel my faith and my faith as more spirit-led and how I said I want to hone my instincts. But there's so many pitfalls and margins when you're relying on gut instinct or the Holy Spirit. So I'm just wondering if anyone wants to talk about just the balancing between the two, when to listen to one or the other, or if they're the same, and the muddiness between the two concepts. The second question I have is the role of language in spiritual struggles. So in Mandarin, at least in the way I grew up with in Malaysia, the language is saturated with ghosts, spirits, the afterlife. For example, there is a ghost festival where, in non-comprehensive terms, we believe that the relatives from the underworld are allowed out for a month and we have to feed them with human food or else they'll curse us. And since English is linked to the Enlightenment and also a relatively new language compared to Chinese or Hebrew, I wonder about the effect of language in discussing this topic of spiritual struggles and attribution, and even in the act of coining the term spiritual attributions, because we had no language for that before. And as someone who does offer Mandarin therapy, I wonder how using a different language also affects the level of spirituality in the therapeutic process. And also the language of emotion differs in meaning depending on the language. So if anger is linked to spiritual struggles in English, what would that mean for your native tongue or the tongue of your ancestors or your clients? Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. I'm going to invite Grace and Dr. Exline to come and have a seat here. And Dr. Williams is going to be joining us live from Houston. There she is. Hello, Dr. Williams. Glad to have you. Please come and have a seat here together. I might be biased, but I just often feel like where else but Fuller do we have these rich kind of conversations cross-culturally, cross-theoretical, cross-language, cross-race. It's just an amazing place to be a part of. I'm going to come over there now. Dr. Williams, make sure she's with us.
Hello, everybody.
Yes, beautiful. Okay. We're operating on all cylinders today, I hope. So I just want to give you a second, Julie, to see if there's anything you wanted to respond to from Dr. Williams or Grace's comments.
I'm just so excited to hear the cross-cultural perspective that you're bringing in on this. It's fascinating to think about the role of that language could play in all of this, and just the different supernatural types of beliefs that can occur across cultures. Just hearing about your journey with this was just fascinating. And for Dr. Williams, just thank you so much for the rich discussion of chaplaincy and so much about the gift of being able to be present for people in the moment, which is something I'll be talking about a little bit tomorrow, but you really just are bringing such a depth and a richness to the discussion of what chaplains do, and also clarifying that in chaplaincy, because you're really dealing with people in those immediate crises, that the focus on growth and things like that, some of those are might be longer term therapy goals, but you're trying to more provide a safe place and stabilize more. So I'm always in awe of the work that chaplains do. I'm somebody who kind of freezes when there's a crisis, so I'm always really glad that there are people who are good at dealing with people who are in crisis. I'm like, okay, let's sit down and talk about this over a longer period of time. So really grateful for the work that you do and for your insights.
And just so you all know, we can see Dr. Williams there. We're not going to crane our neck over here. We can look and see her there. So wonderful. Let me jump into some of these questions and see if we can get to as many as we can. Dr. Exline, do you know of any studies that look at spiritual struggles, particularly with clergy, Catholic or Protestant clergy?
There might be some. I don't have like an encyclopedic knowledge of all the research on struggles.
You don't.
Ken is better because he wrote much more of the book. So there might be something, but I can't say here's who did it and here's what they found.
Okay.
We need that type of work, and apologies for if somebody's done something amazing on that and I'm just not aware of it.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. This is an interesting question. Is there any similarities, do you believe, between spiritual struggles and William James's concept of the sick soul?
Well, I'm not an expert on James either, but I know that the concept of the sick soul is the idea that some people have the more naturally sunny disposition, who we called the once born, correct? The healthy-minded, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And that there's a lot to be said for that, but that I think sometimes James seemed to be talking about that there could sometimes be more depth or richness in spiritual life for the twice born or the sick soul, the people who had the more melancholy edge to their personality, or maybe some past wounding where they had to explore and maybe challenge some prior beliefs, heal from things, and maybe be kind of accommodating, having to make some new meaning structures, and maybe having some powerful spiritual experiences along the way. So I would say that people who would be of James's sick soul type would definitely be the people who'd be reporting more struggles, but there's also that potential for growth through them. It sounds like, okay, never mind. It sounded like the mic might have died, but I just pulled away.
And there's also this difference, right, between like questing, or some of what James might talk about as sick soul is not necessarily related to the tension or struggle or conflict that you describe in spiritual struggles. Would it be fair to say that?
I think so. I mean, the questing can happen regardless of whether somebody is currently struggling, but the questing might for some people be triggered by a struggle or a searching or a trying to resolve pain or find a new meaning system that's going to help you heal from something. But the questing is something that I think overlaps with struggle but doesn't require struggle. So you could struggle and not go and do questy things, and you could be a questy person who's not struggling very much.
A questy person, I like that. Grace or Dr. Williams, do you want to chime in on that at all?
Yeah, it's striking me that one of the distinctions in chaplaincy is that you have been catapulted into a quest, a way of questing that you did not ask for, and you didn't sort of say, yes, now I am on this journey. And so there's this dynamic and this tension between I'm having this struggle and I kind of want to stop, and yet this journey, this quest has a life of its own. Whether that's because people are coming to me and saying decisions need to be made about this medical care, or we need to get you to a safe space, or I'm looking for my loved one and I don't know where they are. And so you have this duality that's happening that is that adds dynamics to the struggle. And that's where some of the hospitality pieces come in for chaplaincy, because it's a way for the body to tell the spirit and the mind and the emotions, there is a safe space. So I think that's for chaplaincy, that's where that tension between the spiritual struggle and the journey comes into play. For the body experience to lead the way in that portion of the journey.
That's great. Grace? No? Okay. Here's another kind of clinical question. I think this keeps coming up in a variety of ways, and maybe Dr. Williams, you were already kind of alluding to it. How can we help people process their negative feelings / anger towards God while connecting them or helping them stay connected with their relationship with God?
I will be talking more about that tomorrow.
Okay.
When I get more into intervention things, but basically giving people the space and the safety and normalizing experiences of anger toward God can have the effect of helping people to feel more that they can approach God and maintain a resilient relationship. So yeah, some of these intervention questions, that's going to be tomorrow's focus. So I'll talk more about those things.
Okay.
But
So
yes.
that's a teaser. Make sure you come back tomorrow. But Grace or Dr. Williams, do you want to chime in?
I can speak on this a little bit. Oh, sorry.
So go ahead, Grace.
I have worked with clients who are either in denial that they are angry at God, or that they are expressing direct anger at God. And I think of something for me to always hold on to is go at the pace of the client. Don't go ahead of them. Just be behind them. Know that you're supporting them. But something I also do a lot of is modeling that anger, reflecting it back, saying like, I'm angry for you. I'm angry with you. And making sure my face, my body is angry too, to know that they're not alone. Because I think that's the worst thing that can happen is when you're alone and angry and you have nowhere else to go, and that anger just festers and internalizes.
Yeah, I agree absolutely. And something that, depending on if I've learned enough in the story of that person, what they mean by God, because of course that's an expansive understanding, but if they have a relationship with Scripture, just saying, going to Psalms and saying, can you think of any psalm where someone is expressing some anger? Or as Dr. Exline pointed out, in our relationships, our healthiest relationships, we want to express honestly about what's going on with us because we know that that's a necessary part of healthy relationship. So saying to people in a crisis moment, you have a limited amount of energy right now. So can you be where you are and feel what you feel and sort of trust God in that process to be holistically loving and big enough to walk with you in that journey? And sometimes they can, or sometimes they can't, but just sort of that permission giving activity. And I love what Grace shared, even the reflecting back can help them to breathe. And again, further down the road, there might be more that needs to be said about that, but in a crisis moment, that permission giving is vital.
That's great, thank you. So a lot of times what I'm trying to do here is translate questions, so forgive me, friends online or in person, if I don't quite get this right. I think there's a question here about sort of the relationship between maybe a more traditional, fundamentalist, literal interpretation of Scripture and a more progressive or liberal interpretation. The question I think has to do with, is there a sense that people might be more prone to spiritual struggle if their biblical point of view doesn't fit with their experience in life? Whereas maybe a more progressive, open experience of Scripture might allow for less spiritual struggle. I hope I'm getting that question right.
Yeah, it's tricky when we've looked at this kind of thing empirically. A lot of times fundamentalism is associated with less report of spiritual struggle. But you could see a variety of reasons for that. People might be afraid to report the struggles, or it might be that that sense of certainty that's provided by fundamentalism is protecting against struggle. But I would speculate that when people are holding on to a set of beliefs very tightly, whether they're religious beliefs, political beliefs, whatever it is, belief that a relationship is going to work. And when you're holding on to it really tightly, it is very threatening if you start to get evidence that isn't fitting with the belief. So I think that even though for a lot of people, holding on to a belief tightly, as often happens with fundamentalism in religion, is a way to protect yourself from some of these scary doubts or questions. When they do break through, it can be really terrifying. So, people who I know who have left fundamentalism have often experienced so much fear. Like there's some fear being in the tradition, but then there's definite fear with leaving, because you've been taught that this is such an authoritative source. This is the authoritative source. So there's that fear of questioning it or having experiences that would lead you to disregard it, challenge it, modify it. So yeah, I think fundamentalism can really add another layer of complexity around struggles. Even though fundamentalists don't tend to report more struggles, they tend to report a little bit less from what I recall.
So it's almost like, if I could say it a different way, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's the rigidity with which one holds one's belief, whether traditional or progressive, that might create problems.
Yeah, I think anytime a person holds on to a certain belief, it's kind of like a lifeline. This is the thing that's keeping me safe, is this belief. It's going to be really scary. You don't want anybody, puncturing your life preserver.
Yeah, I'm thinking of Paul and the thorn in his side, and I often have patients or care receivers who will go to that, as a way of trying to make meaning. This is, then this spiritual struggle is the thorn in my side. And as I shared in chaplaincy, in the acute nature, it is really not the perfect time to really break apart that theological understanding. But to offer a place for them to be reflective about, well, then what does that mean of your
image of God, or your capacity to feel God's presence or God's love with you. So it's not so much dealing with the actual interpretation, because that is what it is in the moment. But is there a barrier from feeling the presence, the love of God? And of course, this is for people who feel like they have an understanding of what that particular image is meaning for them, that thorn in the side, for example.
I wanted to add that as Dr. Exline was speaking, I thought of like a parallel metaphor. It's like how when we go to therapy, we don't want to impose like, oh, our parents were bad, parents were perfect. Like it's always like either or. Never, they're both good and bad. They were imperfect, they are human, they did their best, or they didn't do their best. And being able to hold that ambiguity and that like their humanness, and I think that speaks to that rigidity that a lot of us come to healers, chaplains, therapists with, and we're like, I want to hold on to this, and I want to hold on to this, but there is going to be a stripping away or a reconstruction that happens as you struggle with that.
I think it's very easy to judge ourselves and others for being rigid. I personally find it very helpful to think about, not always, but so much of the time, rigidity is coming out of fear.
Yeah, I love to think about the end of Matthew, and maybe there's no pure sheep and no pure goats. There's a question here. You've been studying moral struggle as one of the spiritual struggle issues. Is there any work that's done on people struggling when they come to the perception of the immorality of God? You mentioned some of that, right? Like God drowns the Egyptians. God kills people.
Yeah, it's a really interesting angle, because I always think just about anger at God or mistrusting God. But it's a fascinating question just to think about how if somebody was challenging, they were questioning their own beliefs about God's morality, how that could not only lead to divine struggles, which is what I would think of, but it might lead to a sense of, well, what's my moral compass supposed to be like then? If this is the way that God is presented, am I supposed to behave in ways like that, or can I really trust this God? I like the idea of connecting that more with moral struggles. I just automatically go to the divine struggles, and I've probably had a little bit of tunnel vision about that.
Let me see if I can capture this question. I think it's an interesting one. Again, a very clinical question. When a client comes to when a believing client comes to a believing therapist, and somehow they know that, but the client is going through religious trauma or spiritual struggle, how do we maintain rapport with them if the client begins to wonder if we can hold that with them? Does that make sense? You're nodding your head, Grace, so I'm going to invite you into that.
Great question. I believe my professors will have better answers. But I think, when we start therapy, we say, first off, safety is my concern. Like, I want to make sure you feel safe. And that is my first instinct. I want to make sure that whatever you bring to the room, you are safe enough to tell me, whether or not it takes 3 seconds or 3 weeks or 3 months. And also, if they ask, I think it depends on the therapist's level of comfortability, of self-disclosure. It also depends on how comfortable the therapist is with theology, right? I'm completely fine with if you come in with something completely different from what I grew up with. I lay that all on the table here today. But that's the beauty of being a Christian as well. Like, it's all relational. I want to learn from you. I want to be taught by you. And maintaining that posture is hard. It's hard when there's a lot of anger, a lot of hurt. And that may hurt you as a therapist. Like, they may project that onto me, and that's okay. Can I still repair it? Can I still model forgiveness? So I think safety, at the end of the day, safety.
Dr. Williams,
Yeah, there are so many things. Thank you, Grace, because there's so many things that are coming to my mind. And so I think, first of all, the relationship piece, as Grace is alluding to, is mutual. And so understanding moment to moment, there's a mutuality. And there's even some work that has been done for pastoral care or spiritual care and chaplaincy about sort of reclaiming transference and going from it being this horrible, horrible, bad, no, to wait, there's something happening here in the spiritual realm when you share your story and my story is coming up. And so instead of just backing away as the chaplain and saying, no, I'm not supposed to be feeling anything in my own embodied experience, to lean into that. And in my training as a chaplain, when I was a student, there was this tension between, I don't want to be inauthentic. So if I felt internally, I can't hold the space, this someone is bringing something up that I'm like, I don't know. For example, praying for the resurrection of a child that has just died, right? Can I hold, what is the authentic response to that? And my supervisor saying, authenticity doesn't necessarily mean on the same ground in the same space, but where is the representation of God, Christ, love, grace, and mercy? And so that constant movement within this mutual relationship, I think, allows for the spiritual realm to become more prevalent, even though both people might not in the moment be able to articulate or acknowledge that. And so I think it's one of the beautiful gifts of the work that I do, that I get to be challenged, that I get to say, what are my limitations? It allows me to grow and flourish in beautiful ways.
Thank you for that. I just want to note someone empathically asked if your luggage arrived. So we want to say, yes, it did. Thank you so much.
Yes, they thankfully did.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
I did write a complaint to the airline, which is something I've never done in my life, because there were a series of about 7 errors that led to this. So for me, that was a struggle.
There are so many good questions here, and some of them are so provocative, there's no way we can answer them in 3 minutes and 30 seconds. So I'm jumping around here really quickly to see if there's something that we could sort of answer.
And one nice thing is some of the more clinically oriented questions will also be relevant tomorrow.
Yeah. I think what I'm going to say is that we're going to bring this to a close 3 minutes early, and that way maybe you can come up and ask some questions if you're here in the audience today. But before we thank our speaker and respondents, again, a couple of housekeeping things. Let's see, make sure I'm on the right here. Yeah, for any prospective students that are joining us online today or in person, I want to remind you that there is an SOP MFT admissions information session that will be held online beginning at 1 p.m. today. That's correct, right? Someone nod at me? Okay. If you're interested in attending, reach out to our admissions team at admissions@fuller.edu. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. Remember, we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Some more of the clinical kinds of stuff we're going to keep coming up tomorrow, so we're excited about that. If you're receiving CE units here in Travis, make sure that you stamp out and turn in your evaluations. If you're online, Zoom attendance for CE, your attendance was recorded. You're going to get a CE evaluation form for each day, and it'll be emailed out to you on Friday. Thank you for being here, everyone. Thank you for joining us on the line. Please, once again, thank our speaker and respondents, Dr. Julia Exline, Grace Chan, Dr. Jacqueline Williams. Thank you so much. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow.